So I show here some mathematical instruments which you can purchase, as I did, at the university bookstore. Home Depot will offer you even more. I call to your attention in particular the one in the upper left called a Rolo tape, but we'll find that it was called something else in the past. Crafters have many special purpose tools. Quilters in Wisconsin are familiar with many of these, I'm sure. iPhones provide you with a profusion of apps. These for a measures toolkit, such as in my title, as well as rulers. We also, many of us have those handy dandy levels on our phones. I don't know that we ever use them, but we like them. And we are taught from an early age how to measure. Now, this was not true in the era with which Florence ended her presentation, namely the 17th and 18th century. Those centuries marked the availability of measuring instruments to consumers in a broader range than would have been possible in the 16th century, for example. They were used certainly for scientific purposes, often made to order, often high quality, very expensive. They served the needs of astronomers who were aiming at greater accuracy. They also were used by natural philosophers, we would today call them physicists, whose work took on a decidedly quantitative character as the 17th and 18th century wore on. Now, this was at a time also that practical activities of economics and social circumstance required notions of measurement. Those practical applications included such things as surveying, important, of course, for persons of wealth and property. This is where that Rolo tape had its origin. Actually, its origins go back to antiquity, but it is known in the English terminology as a waywiser. And this one dates from 1800, doesn't look too much different from the one that is sold now in plastic at Home Depot. It's, of course, of utility in determining the length of roads and is hence relevant to surveying. The building trades have always needed measurement from antiquity on, and they developed specialized tools for this purpose. Here at the top is depicted a carpenter's rule, more about it shortly. Navigation at sea required not only accurate timekeeping mechanisms, but also astronomical observations dependent upon measuring devices, as well as careful observational regimes and practices. Now, perhaps less obvious in this period of time were the needs of measuring devices for, well, it was a time of warfare, so as you see near the bottom, artillery and ballistics were matters that engaged many in the military, as well as mathematical practitioners, as they were known. On a slightly different plane, we had specialized measuring devices for measuring the size of pearls. That's the instrument indicated by the upper arrow. There's some pretty big pearls involved in this. And then down at the bottom, and this is a prelude to something that we're going to hear about from later speakers, the existence of different kinds of measuring schemes, systems of weights and measures, depending on whether you're in London, Paris, or the Rhineland, as is shown here. Now, for an audience in Wisconsin where there has been a cash bar, perhaps it is not inappropriate for me also to mention the application of measurement to what was called gauging. That is, determining the contents of a cask, of a barrel of ale or of wine or of other substances, but mainly those were the ones at issue. It was not a trivial problem to determine the contents of such containers. And there were specialized measuring tools developed and described in books of mathematical instruments of the time just for this purpose. I should, of course, also mention that mathematics was becoming more prominent as a leisure or recreational activity, at least a fairly benign form of mathematics, and only for those for whom leisure time was possible and the purchase of instruments and books for the sake of mathematical recreation was a possibility in the 18th century. The tools themselves ranged from created on commission, or as was said at the time, bespoke, or ready-made. Of course, there were more of those made on commission at the beginning, more ready-made towards the end of the 18th century. They came in various media, as you can see, including silver, brass, wood, and paper. They were often, described in the books that I have pointed to, and they also were specialized for local weights and measures. You could buy them bundled, you could buy them in sets, according to your pocketbook and taste, or as part of a suite of products. Here, for example, you could buy a pocket case of mathematical instruments at the end of the 18th century. Now, these were, in general, all the work of what were called mathematical practitioners. These were individuals, some with considerable training, some with more practical skill, who made instruments. They also wrote books. They sold both of them at their shops. Some of them printed their own books. Some printed the books of others and encouraged their paying students to buy all manner of learning aids. Some copperplate engravers of the period also put scales on brass instruments and sold both brass instruments as well as cheaper, if more fragile, printed versions. All of them at this period of time in the 18th century capitalized on a fashion for mathematics, and in particular, for the need for instruction. We are accustomed now to getting instruction booklets with our tools, and if worse comes to worse and we've lost them, we can always go to eHow to figure out how to use something. Such was not the case in the 17th and 18th century, and often the descriptions of how to use these items were quite detailed and presumed that one knew very little about how to use a carpenter's rule. Likewise, there were whole books designed to teach you how to gauge casks and barrels, and perhaps, by the way, to get a job as an excise agent and make a living as a royal gauger. Many thanks.